China, China, China. You know, today's society rightfully supports the ideology that girls run the world. But we believe a proper case can be made for China as a close second. And in a couple of minutes, you'll understand why. In recent years, China's exports to countries forming part of the European Union, like Germany, Italy, France and Spain, have increased immensely despite the various measures lawmakers have taken to ensure their countries don't depend on China too much economically and to make sure they don't face risks of having poor diplomatic relations with the country. However, we've also come to learn that strategies to avoid risks are risks themselves, and the EU has been unable to deal with the increase in China's trading power the right way. Back in 2019, for example, the European Union outrightly called China a systemic rival when trade tensions escalated between the two economic giants. Did this conflict last? Your guess is as good as ours. It did not. And that was because China took the high road, extending an olive branch when the government claimed it was ready to work with Brussels to better their bilateral relations. This approach by China's government to their trade involvement with other countries saw their value of exports nearly double between 2018 and 2022. And currently, China remains the world's leading exporter of manufactured industrial goods, which begs the question everyone not Chinese has asked themselves at some point or other. Can any country beat China at their economic game? Well, we'll leave that to you to decide in the comments below. Now, throughout the first half of 2023, this leading position China secured has reflected in the European Union too. China remains the primary source of goods for the European Union, and although there were concerns expressed by EU officials at one point about China taking advantage of the machineries it churns out to gain access to sensitive state information in other countries, there was still a significant increase in China's export of these machineries, particularly phones and computers. And if that wasn't enough, China also stands as the largest provider of rare earths and critical raw materials for the EU. When you add all these up, you have to kind of agree with John Blaxland, a professor specialising in international security and intelligence studies at the Australian National University, that China has effectively persuaded major industrial economies to heavily rely on their exports for survival, and it's going to be very difficult for these economies to disentangle themselves from China's commercial hold at this point. Now, let's focus on that for a moment, the level of China's commercial hold on other countries, as that's where the issues between China and the EU have come from. Just recently, the EU once again raised an alarm about the trade predicament its member countries have been facing because of China's influence in the trading space. Overall, the issue centered around a staggering trade deficit between the EU and China, and the need for China to open up its markets to remedy the problem. See, a trade deficit happens when a country's imports happen to be more than its exports, and because China is the leading exporter in the EU, other countries have had to deal with importing China's goods at a high level while exporting little to China in return. The result? Trade deficits all around the EU that many of these countries no longer want to have to deal with. And because of the severity of the issue, it's become a widespread problem that officials of the European Union have tried to solve themselves. Some have recommended China open up its market to import more as expected. And some have even gone as far as contemplating severing ties with China altogether. However, nobody expects the EU to sever ties with China. They're literally the economy responsible for 14% of global goods exports and the commercial sustenance of various other countries. You can't just lay them off without having plans to mitigate the consequences that course of action would bring. And that's been the thought process around Europe for some time now. Completely decoupling from trade with China would be impractical for countries in the EU. So what's the best next step? Apparently, the EU is taking a different approach. They want to ensure their economic security against China by domestically producing goods of strategic importance. These will be goods that not only contribute to the exporting power of the various EU countries, but also goods that China will need and will open its market up to import. Now, information on these goods is still vague, but it at least helps us understand that while the EU leaders have come to the conclusion that China is an important trade partner, They're serious about reducing their dependency and vulnerability to China by looking inward and creating something that increases their bargaining power. Good for them. Experts who have analysed the matter have also come to the conclusion that a complete decoupling from China by the EU, if it ever happened, would likely take place within a conflict scenario. And obviously nobody wants that because of the economic consequences it would leave. So it's up to countries to build up their game in the trade scene and decrease their reliance on China as an economic partner. Fortunately, the US is a good example of a country that's already demonstrated much progress in decreasing its reliance on China as an economic partner, and other countries can take lessons from them. Their journey to becoming less reliant on China started in 2018, when then-President Donald Trump imposed 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. His measure was criticised at the time, quite alright, but boy did it pay off. Because by 2022, data from US trade sources indicated a decline in China's share of US imports from 21 to 16%. And yes, this affected the level at which Chinese businesses trade with America, and is one of the reasons there's an ongoing US-China trade conflict. But despite all that, American companies still maintain a close tie with China until today. Responding to the tariff measure, China immediately increased their own tariffs on American exports, and to fill the trade gaps that they knew would be left by America, they lowered their trade barriers for other European countries as well. A good example of that lowered barrier can be seen in the automotive sector, where European car makers have seen a surge in sales to China, unlike US automakers who have been excluded from China's markets. For all this success between China and other European countries in the automotive sector, though, it's only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down due to the same factor: China's commercial hold on countries as a leading exporter. Chinese automakers are starting to take control of the car-making scene, both domestically and internationally, which we've discussed in a previous video, so be sure to check that out. And we know that once these car makers fully take over the domestic car market in China and the international market too, European car makers will have no market in China or outside of China to export to. The proof is in the pudding, as they say, and we've already seen signs of this incoming prediction. Up to 3 of Europe's top-selling electric vehicles last year were Chinese imports, constituting 3 to 4% of total European car registrations, a notable increase from 0 a few years prior. Now, projections from Allianz also suggest that Chinese car sales in Europe could reach 1.5 million vehicles by 2030, equivalent to 13.5% of EU's 2022 production. In response to this, countries in the EU have also started enacting strategies and policies that can reduce their dependency on China's automobiles. For instance, France has enacted a law stating that subsidies for new electric vehicles will be determined based on the emissions produced by their manufacturers. That's a pretty smart move because Chinese car makers heavily rely on electricity generated from coal for their cars, which means they'll be heavily impacted by this policy. Meanwhile, in Germany, a dominant force in the automotive industry, the government recently unveiled a strategy aimed at cautioning companies to lessen their reliance on China or take on a greater share of financial risk themselves when trading with them. The discourse has apparently evolved to adopt a more critical and apprehensive stance regarding trade and investments with China, and from a perspective of businesses operating on the ground, that of the government, the motto is avoid, 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 and avoid as much as possible. So, what exactly is the solution to the China-EU trade conundrum? And how can countries successfully ensure a trade balance between their imports and exports in relation to China? We've got our answers, but we'd love to hear from you too, so let us know in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed watching this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on the post notification bell for more. Until next time, stay thoughtful and take care.